Welcome to FoodTech Stories. I'm your host, Megan Thomas, a marketing and communications expert who is focused on how emerging technology is adopted in food and agriculture. On each episode, we talk with leaders, innovators, and storytellers who are shaping the future of our food and food system. If you value our content, please consider subscribing. Today on the podcast, my guest is Adam Yee, and Adam Yee is founder of Umai Works, and he's formerly of Motif Foodworks and the Better Meat Co. He's also a fellow podcast host and has been hosting My Food Job Rocks since 2016. Welcome to the podcast, Adam.
Great. Glad to be here, Megan. Good to meet you actually in Durham. Good to know more people in the space.
We have a thriving ag tech, biotech community here in the Triangle, so it's growing all the time. Right back at you. So what first brought you into food tech?
I'm a food scientist in training. I got my bachelor's in food science. We don't really learn about food tech necessarily. I don't think the term was really coined until about 5 years after I was out of college. I really enjoyed learning about food science when I was doing my bachelor's in Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo in California. I then had my first job in manufacturing where I was making granola bars and then switched to product development with protein bars. That was when I was first introduced to kind of food tech. When I started My Food Job Rocks, I kept on interviewing people, and eventually every interview kind of charted this path into a certain category, which is essentially plant-based meat. There was a time in this era of My Food Job Rocks in the early days where everyone was talking about plant-based meat. I would always ask them when I was kind of like a newbie podcaster, what's a food technology that's really exciting you today? A lot of them were saying plant-based meat, and I got really interested. There was also this kind of overlap of cell-based meat or meat that's grown without harming an animal. I then interviewed an animal activist named Paul Shapiro, and he invited me to be a co-founder of Better Meat Co. My introduction to food tech was actually just digging in through this emerging sector as I was exploring essentially food science in my podcast.
And how do you think of food science and food tech or food technologies being different, or how are they related?
I have a hard definition for food tech. A food business with venture money, excluding CPG. Basically, that's food raised in, I think the real core term of it is food raised at tech valuations, which has changed quite significantly in the past couple of years. But I do think that is the core of what food tech was coined to be.
More like a class of business versus the process itself or the emerging technology itself. Interesting.
I 100% believe that.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I really like that, Adam. So what did you learn from those early industry experiences? You were kind of there in the early days in some of these spaces. What did you learn?
That we always thought we were late, which is always funny. Beyond Meat Impossible was just kind of the heyday. I think Beyond Meat just IPO'd to a huge amount while we were starting Better Meat Co. And I think a lot has kind of shifted. Started from Better Meat Co., scaled raised money, which I think is a fascinating experience. Went through the whole process of commercializing, and we have a successful product in launch. That was quite a simple product, a mixture of certain ingredients that we know in the industry, and then we would sell it to meat manufacturers. The company pivoted to a more technological game. Some would argue to raise more money, which is a valid point, which was mycelium. And so I decided to leave at that point. Then I went to Motif Foodworks, which was a biotech play, precision fermentation, take yeast cells and coach them to turn into essentially spit out bovine myoglobin. That went into some type of lawsuit situations. It was impossible. There's a legal battle between Meaty and Better Meat Co. as well. So this is kind of an interesting play on the core of what food tech is.
What did you take away from those experiences then?
It's a really fun, exciting time that kind of went through the sugar high of just spiking and then crashing. That tells me a lot about just the industry. Now, I still have a lot of friends in this industry. I do have a lot of friends that have been laid off in this industry too, so they have a big disdain. There was this notion that we thought the tech model, which is like blitz scaling and raising a bunch of money, could fit into the food model. And the answer is people are scared of technology in their food. I think we also had a lot of hubris because we're all human. The food tech entrepreneurs, I do think the nonprofits and the philanthropic organizations have a little bit of hubris too, thinking that it would all change. I also think we miscalculated some environmental crises that would have happened that I think has changed throughout the life cycle of the category. I don't regret it. I did very well in this era of learning new technologies. I met with a lot of really smart people. I learned faster than any other industry that I would ever think about doing. If I was stuck in craft or Mondelez or whatever, I would be checking labels off and making sure this claim was good. I don't want to do that. I want to invent things. I want to do cool stuff. I think taking a bet on new technologies, if it crashes or if it doesn't crash, I think you still learn more than the average person. Yeah, the zeitgeist of it pushes you to learn faster than everyone else.
When you think about that time, is there something that didn't make a lot of sense that you saw people maybe investing in or rushing toward, but you never really believed it was going to pan out?
I think when you have a lot of money flooding the system, cogs and general business sense goes out the window. I've seen a lot of decisions being made where the business model inherently did not make sense, but because there's so much money being pumped into this that it didn't matter to them. The only thing that mattered was getting enough data to get another round of funding. I think once you get into that mentality or getting acquired or whatever. And this happens all the time in consumer packaged goods, by the way. Like the David Bar guys are doing this right now. They're burning a ton of money to get essentially growth. Tech has done it ad nauseum. Some can argue that that model has worked in some cases. When I came to food, it was just really interesting to see this venture model, which is about burn, 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 and grow, 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 get kind of challenged. Every food business I've ever talked to says like, "Oh, we need to have a sustainable business model," but that gets thrown out the window once you get like $1 million just flown onto your lap. I think Motif raised like 345 million. I got my millions mixed up, but that is the issue with a lot of money. It affects everything: your cognitive abilities to think rationally, and also your ego.
In having worked in a startup environment and in larger food companies, you actually in a large company are quite scrappy in how you approach a launch. And you have to think about that kind of in terms of the overall portfolio. What are unit economics going to be right out of the gate? Finance has got to approve that. Certainly, your retail or food service channel partners are going to be expecting a consistent product at a certain price right out of the gate. There isn't going to be a lot of patience for anything that differs from that. So, very, very different. I love that you brought that out. Anything that happened or that you observed or you believed in that you think is going to have its moment in the future? Its time is still yet to come.
Yeah, I think we're in a pretty big supply crisis when it comes to meat. It's just a very fragile ecosystem. What really illuminated me to this was a book made by a New York Times reporter named Chloe Sorvino. She had a book called Raw Deal. First half of the book really explained to me like essentially the meat industry, which it's a fascinating technology. And if you looked at it in that lens, where we have somehow figured out a way to like essentially mass produce a premium product, which is meat that we have to eat every day and now is growing faster than ever. It follows the same playbook as essentially tech. They developed this technology. It went through a huge period of essentially distrust. The Jungle is one example of that book that really showed like, what are you doing grinding human fingers into meat? It also went through an acquisition issue as well, which kind of mirrors big tech. Small meat manufacturers got destroyed because the assets were too big. A lot of the companies like JBS gobbled them up, essentially. It's almost jarring, just kind of similarities between big meat agriculture and essentially big tech, Amazon and Google. There is a bet I have there will be some type of disaster in this kind of fragile meat ecosystem, especially beef, I would say, which we're already seeing beef prices rise up. I think that will happen. It's just hard to say when, and you just never know with climate change. But I do think there is a possibility that it can happen, and then someone's going to swoop in. There is also, in my opinion, evidence of essentially funding spikes when crises happen because of climate. And one example is chocolate, and then another example is eggs. Those have both suffered essentially spikes in demand due to issues that affected supply, and then money just rolled into these companies when that happens. Companies that are lucky, keyword is lucky, to be in that type of supply crisis really do get essentially an injection of funding. The issue is you just cannot predict it.
And can it be sustained?
The goal for like any of these things is not essentially be sustained, but be reactive. As much as we don't like to say that, that is going to happen when these supply crises hit, is that the company that's most reactive will get the most benefit.
So you're saying reacting at the time when that happens, then kind of going back to business as usual, but then reacting if it happens again versus making it their new model. Okay. I actually worked for a very large meat company in marketing, and so very familiar with what you've talked about in terms of the way those organizations are run and how they grew through acquisition. Also, that they've had 2, 3, 4 generations in many cases to perfect their operations and depreciate their equipment and are able to run it really efficiently at very low cost.
My first internship was actually in Cargill Slaughterhouse. I know a little bit of inkling of what happens over there. They do things that will cut costs. They're at that stage right now in their business to do that.
Right. And the harvest operation.
The immigrants are the most interesting part of it all. That's a longer topic.
Why did you start your podcast?
I started my podcast, My Food Job Rocks. Yeah, it was almost 10 years. It started actually with an article from a friend named Nicole Galassi, who was just talking about how software jobs are cool and food industry jobs are not. She started this organization called Food Greds. I reached out to her saying, like, I'm interested in helping out. I was listening to a lot of podcasts at the time, and then I decided to just okay, I'll interview my friends and then I'll post the episodes, see how they work on LinkedIn. Then kept doing it weekly. The way you get consistent in your craft is to do it on a consistent basis. I've taken breaks here and there, but in general, I've had like over 300 episodes of My Food Job Rocks. And honestly, I just love doing it. One, interviewing my friends or my connections has been really rewarding. Two, they have led me through amazing opportunities. I would have never been an entrepreneur if I didn't interview my co-founder, Better Meek, if I didn't do this podcast. So many different opportunities. I now have a paid gig with Startup CPG. I keep on getting pitches to interview the president of Amy's Kitchen. Some of these things are, I can't believe this happened through just doing this podcast. And my podcast is not like popular. It is a very niche podcast to a very specific type of person.
It is interesting. And having done this almost 2 years myself, I'm personally able to connect different topics together and in ways that I wouldn't have if I hadn't gone deep into some of these conversations with people who are actually making these things happen. It's a lot of fun to do, isn't it?
100%.
It's really been a strong component of your career and how it's grown.
Yeah, it's almost like the glue that sticks everything together almost.
Yeah, I like it. I like it. Well, you've gone back to school to get your master's. So why go back to school?
One, because I can. I've worked with a lot of PhDs and stuff like that. This is a decently unique situation. I've worked with the professor before, actually, and I've known the professor for a while. They've always been fans of my work, especially my podcast. And my current PI person who like I report to is someone I was advising her on a grant project to improve food science curriculum. So it kind of goes full circle there. What I've learned is like, okay, I'd rather go to a place where I enjoy working with while also maybe getting an advanced degree. There's also something I really want to study too. Last year, I did have a falling out for another startup I did called Sobo Foods, which ended up with me trying to like figure out what to do. Basically, I started a consulting agency that pays for my bills and pays for grad school, which has been really nice. I did some research with Stanford about AI because I was in San Francisco at the time and learning about AI and the impacts of the food industry. Stanford was doing, I would say, rudimentary stuff, like essentially stuff that, okay, if we apply LLMs to like food, what happens? And I was like, okay, well, this is interesting that Stanford is doing this. That means like, okay, then no one else is going to do this for a long time. So I decided to really just throughout like the thought process and took a year of convincing my current professor to do this. AI is coming. It's going to be probably slower than we think. The food industry is also not very good at adopting things, I would say, compared to most industries. I was like, okay, well, if I stayed at Stanford, I just don't think I would get as much value as if I went to North Carolina. In terms of like the challenge it would be to see adoption of AI technology, and I was right. San Francisco is light years ahead of understanding AI compared to anywhere else in the world because they're obsessed with it. And there's some issues with that, but North Carolina doesn't really have a clue. And I would say most cities, honestly, except for like maybe San Francisco and maybe New York in some sectors about AI. That is where I think like, okay, I'm going to sit here. I'm going to study it for a long time. I'm going to understand a few things. Hopefully the goal is to write essentially fundamental research that can really push the industry forward and like getting people more comfortable with technology. I do think taking this at a commercial angle can be kind of reckless. And I've seen it. People ask me all the time for advice for their AI startup. Then they die in 2 months. People are too excited about this technology, but they don't understand the dissonance of adopting technology. So that's kind of why I'm here, is to really understand the dissonance between this current technology and the food industry.
I'd like to talk more about the dissonance. Where do you see that dissonance? Is it between certain organizations, stakeholders, people? Like, how do you cast that?
People just don't have a fundamental clue about how to use AI. I think this is going to be a huge opportunity for a lot of big consultancies. There's a group I follow called Section that does some really good understanding on AI adoption. Basically, it's really hard. It's really hard for companies to allocate money because they have to raise more money for their stock prices or their IPO, allocate money for AI, and then apply it to their workforce. There's no real key performance indicators. The output, people just don't trust it. Even though humans are probably as flawed, people want 100% certainty with AI. When I landed in San Francisco, Waymo was one of the best examples of like humans kill each other all the time with their cars, but a Waymo, one gets killed, or any autonomous vehicle, one accident can essentially shut down a company, which happened to a competitor of Waymo, Cruise. For me, that's really fascinating. We just don't have the tools or just enough data, honestly, about like how this can be useful. And I think that for me, I see that as an opportunity in the field. We just need more exploratory data understanding these tools. Imagination in a sense works really well on that. Like, let's say articles that talk about like, oh, we believe that because LLMs do this really well, we can apply it to the food industry. And we already see this in law. We see this in coding. Specifically, coding is the best use case of this. There are people doing this that are more closer and honestly have more money than the food industry does. As you follow those models and see how adoption works there, I do think you can apply it to food, but I do think it'll take longer than we think. There's some things that large language models are really good at, such as, it is faster. And I do have a inherent belief that a faster technology generally wins over time.
Very interesting. And do you see AI playing a role at the early stages in terms of product discovery and R&D, or does it have more of a role with commercialization? How do you think about that?
I think it can do both. I'm not going to be like someone who's like utopian about this. I just don't like those people. What I love about technology is that it's looking in hindsight is a lot better than looking kind of forwards. If we think about like technology that really has helped improve our lives, it's all about speed and how we get the information really fast. And I always go back to when some of my old professors would used to say like, "Oh, I had to go to the library. I had to take a little piece of paper and use a magnifying glass to read research papers." Now I can do it like I'm back in college and it's been 10 years since I've been back in college or more than that. And things have changed digitally so much. Google Drive or like how we share information is a lot more prominent and accepting. How we get research papers and how we source research papers is really easy now compared to even 10 years ago. I think that tells me a lot about the speed of how you can get essential research paper. So for what I see with this technology, which I would say is transportive in a sense where it can get information really fast. Is it true information? It's a lot better than it was a year ago, which we have to give some credit to that. The technology is improving quite fast. We actually, as humans, just cannot keep up with how much this has improved. If you look at Will Smith eating spaghetti a year ago versus now, it's totally different about how video, image, and text processing has improved the category so much. I do think the technology shortens things. When you shorten a process, it essentially wins out. You just have to work on the accuracy or whatever. But in general, just throughout your whole life, walking to a plane, there is a reason why that technology has won.
And have you gathered or reviewed any data that speaks to what consumers, the average person, thinks about AI being used in and around their food?
Not intensely, I would say. The general public outside of San Francisco is that people are pretty scared about this technology, especially in the United States. And if you go to like Asia or something, it's a lot of different sentiments about it, which I think is important to understand. Like people in San Francisco are kind of in a bubble, and people who are in tech who have like a lot of money are in a little bit in a bubble in this. And the general public, I think they see it, they use it, but in general, they'll think like tech billionaires are jerks and they're all in charge of this stuff. That's something that is also another dissonance. If consumers don't want to use this technology or are just scared of it, there is an inherent friction that goes on adopting this technology.
And I worked for a startup where who was using CRISPR and gene editing, launched the first CRISPR derived product into the US market. The consumer has to understand the benefit of the technology. Like, why do we need this to develop this product for food for me? They need to understand why, not just that this is cool new technology. They need to understand the benefit of it to them in their lives. What do you see as next for the food tech landscape?
I've interviewed a lot of people in this sense. Louis Boyard, he's a really good food animal activist. A lot of animal activists in the field thought plant-based meat was the answer or plant-based foods was the answer, but now actually a lot of them are pivoting to manufacturing technology that makes animals suffer less, which I think is kind of interesting. So one example he was talking about was desexing male chickens or male chicks. Once you find out that the chicks were male, you threw them in a grinder and essentially end their lives. Now with this technology, you can save a lot of male lives by desexing the eggs before they even hatch. And there's a few other ones like methane and cows. The animal activist play, which has been the key driver of a lot of plant-based funding, is going to how do we reduce animal suffering? Some are effective altruists, some aren't. It depends who you talk to. But these guys generally think of this challenge as like, how do I holistically save as many animal lives as possible? They see the data for meat as it keeps on rising, no matter how you look at it. I just saw some data saying American meat has spiked and is going to keep on rising. Southeast Asia and other countries that are still developing their rich people diet, which is meat, the aspiration to have meat is really powerful, and therefore meat's going to keep on rising there. A lot of them are pivoting towards this kind of reduce animal suffering focus rather than plant-based meats. Does that solve the sustainability crisis? One can argue that people don't care about sustainability anymore. And I think the animal activists are actually kind of leaning towards that too. So to answer your question on what's next for food tech, we'll see how the food tech is going. I think that's going to take a while to adopt, but it seems like a lot of people that are pivoting more towards processing technologies specifically to reduce animal suffering, which is essentially with meat.
So they're just shifting the focus to a different problem, a different aspect of the problem. What's interesting to me is it reminds me of the work that Temple Grandin did decades ago about thinking about the animals. And I'm like, I need to go research that. I hadn't heard much about it. And I'm like, when I find out more about that. Yeah, it should be interesting times ahead. I think the plant based, I definitely thought it was a trend. I was working in that space too. All the data was predicting by 2030 these huge adoption rates. And it turned out to be, at least in the US, more of a fad than a trend. So we'll see if it comes back around because certainly we had meat alternatives for 30 plus years before the Beyond Meats and Impossibles came along.
You can't predict the future in this sense. That's why consumer packaged goods and consumers generally is a really risky category. Things can change in an instant. Ultra processed, RFK, a few other types of factors that you wouldn't have expected about a year or two ago are now getting pushed really hard. That's just naturally what happens in food. There's still fundamental research. Research takes about 5 to 10 years to actually develop. This is a very classic Garner hype cycle situation where hype explodes and then it sinks, and then eventually technology builds to a sustainable level. And we see this from freezing food to telephones to, one can argue, self driving cars is actually one of those things as well.
Absolutely. And to your point before, we are seeing disruptions coming from war, from economic, from climate. Certainly the pandemic, a lot of brands were not investing in innovation in center store, in canned goods and other types of shelf stable goods. Along came the pandemic and their sales shot back up. And you'll lose some of those customers, but the brands that are good at that are keeping some of those consumers as well. It's interesting to think about how these things are interconnected. When we are looking to the future, what are you most excited about?
I mean, I'm just excited where I am right now. I think we can always be so kind of anxious about the future and kind of scared about what's next. And I do think there's a lot to be anxious about, right? That AI is taking people's jobs. There are wars being happening right now. And I think that is a very anxious time. There is a lot to contemplate about this world. Just kind of dodging the question a little bit. But I would say that I think I'm excited that I'm in a place where I can like do something in a comfortable area, the least anxious I've ever been, which I think is something that I think about a lot. And I think that just has to do with like growth. I can take time and study. And I think this is more advice about anxiousness rather than anything. I always give this example whenever I'm like publicly speaking or giving someone advice on publicly speaking or interviewing, is that being anxious and being excited follow kind of the same neural pathways. I don't know if that's like 100% true or how I said it, but in general, if you're anxious and you say you're excited, you can actually convince yourself that you're excited. And I think it's something worth trying. It may not work for everyone, but I do think for me it works a lot. It's helped me in a lot of different things. I do consider anxiousness and excitement polar opposites. I'm the least anxious I've ever been, but would I say that I'm the most excited I've ever been? That's kind of hard to say actually too. And I know that's kind of a very long-winded answer, but I think it might give some more hope in the world.
It's all good. You just had to move to the South and your anxiety went down. Is that what it
Outside the
is?
startup games and also outside of like having a regular job and doing consulting now, it has been less stressful because I don't have to depend on other people making artificial deadlines, which I thought was just extremely annoying. There's going to be like this new luxury about time and how we express our time. That's a longer discussion. Moving to the South, cheaper area with more supportive people, I think has been a lot better for me.
Yeah, I've lived in the South for almost 14 years and I'm originally from the West Coast as well, and I really like it. It's interesting to think about that. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see with AI specifically, kind of beyond food tech coming in, and it does it change for many people how we think about work, much like automation changed work for people after the Industrial Revolution. It's interesting to think about kind of the emergence of more leisure time. Will it change how we think about time?
I think how we're going to view work is different now. I think AI is going to give us an excuse to think about that more because corporates using it quite wrong. I think laying off people and not treating people humanely is something that's really affecting everyone's psyche right now. It's like, why should I care about my job if they're just going to lay me off? That's actually a really big existential deal. So AI is going to change the conversation. I just think it's going to change it in a way we're probably not going to think about. Because efficiency, there's always going to be more work to do.
Yeah, yeah. The goal really shouldn't be to eliminate the need for humans in work. At the end of the day, that isn't maybe what we should be striving for as a society.
In most technological shifts, that's always going to happen. In my opinion, if you're in any field, you are in an age where you can experiment with technology. It's for like essentially $20 a month. And I think you shouldn't ignore this technology, but just embrace it, play around with it, see if you can, like, I don't know, build something that can read your emails. I build things that help me understand complex lectures because I've been out of school for a while. We're at an age where, the technology is there. It doesn't cost that much to play with, and you don't have to be like a
Mm.
master coder, but this can be useful to you as you build your career. I think if you don't take that opportunity, people are going to pass by you.
In many ways, it's like 95% of US adults have mobile phones. Kind of democratizes information in a way, which is interesting, at least for now.
At least, yeah, for now. And I guess my core tenet is always been on technology. I would say number one. Also, always be curious too. So I think those two factors really help
Yeah,
you
I like that.
survive this world in a sense.
I think those are great parting words. Where can people find out more about the work that you're doing?
LinkedIn is probably the best way you can find me. I do a podcast called My Food Job Rocks. That's on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I also have like a 10-part series called Food Products FAQ, which is just like me and another consultant talk about essentially how we do business to make food products. That leads to my business, which is called Umai Works. Essentially, what I do is just help people who just have an idea build their food business. I find that really rewarding. For me, it's just really fun to do that. I also help a bunch of other companies out, and I'll be speaking at Supply Side New Jersey and IFT.
Thanks so much for being on the podcast. I really enjoyed our conversation.
It was really fun.
Thanks for joining us today on the latest episode of Food Tech Stories. Be sure and subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform and keep an eye out for our bi-weekly episodes. I'm your host, Megan Thomas, founder of Ladris 17. Food Tech Stories is edited by TJG Media.